The night sky glowed an eerie orange as flames devoured the Victorian house, a structure that had stood proudly for over a century. The heat was unbearable, the air thick with smoke and the acrid scent of burning wood. Every window shattered under the pressure, sending shards of glass cascading onto the front lawn like fallen stars. Ethan Caldwell stood motionless on the sidewalk, his fingers clenched into fists so tight his nails dug into his palms. He could feel the weight of history, of generations of memories, turning to ash before his eyes. But it wasn't the fire that made his blood run cold. It was the woman standing across the street. Vanessa Holloway, head of the neighborhood's homeowners association, stood in her pristine driveway, clad in silk pajamas and a designer robe. She cradled a steaming cup of coffee in her perfectly manicured hands, watching the inferno with an expression that could only be described as smug satisfaction. The golden porch light above her framed her like a queen surveying her latest conquest. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had known she was ruthless. He had known she wanted him out. But to stand there, so brazen, so victorious, while his family's home burned? It was a level of cruelty that made his stomach twist. Next to her, two HOA board members murmured in hushed tones, occasionally glancing in his direction. He recognized them: Michael Green, the HOA treasurer, and Richard Lawson, her enforcer, a retired cop who had long since abandoned his badge for power of another kind. Their low voices mixed with the crackling of the flames. "This is just terrible," Vanessa said finally, her voice carrying over the sirens. "Such a shame. If only he had agreed to join, we could have helped prevent something like this." Ethan exhaled sharply, his breath shaky with barely contained fury. She thought she'd won. She thought this was over. She had no idea who she was dealing with. 2 months earlier. The morning sunlight cast long shadows over the porch as Ethan sat on the wooden swing, sipping coffee and watching the world slowly wake. The house, with its deep purple trim and intricate wooden details, had been his grandmother's pride and joy. She had spent years restoring every delicate feature, planting the roses that now climbed the front trellis. And now, it was his. He had inherited it not just as a house, but as a legacy. A piece of history that he refused to let be erased. That's when he spotted her, Vanessa Holloway, power walking down the street, an envelope clutched in her perfectly manicured hand as if it were made of solid gold. Ethan sighed. He had seen that determined look before, during HOA meetings he never attended but always heard about. Meetings where Vanessa had slowly tightened her grip on the neighborhood, shaping it into her own personal kingdom. She reached his mailbox, hesitated for a moment, then carefully slipped the envelope inside before pulling out her phone. She angled the camera toward his home, snapping multiple photos, her lips pressed together in distaste. Ethan knew exactly what she was thinking. The Victorian house was an eyesore to her. The vibrant purple trim, the wild roses, the wind chimes that sang in the breeze, none of it fit the sterile, beige uniformity she had forced upon the rest of the neighborhood. And now, she had finally come for him. Curiosity burned in his chest, but he forced himself to take another slow sip of coffee before rising from the swing and making his way to the mailbox. He plucked out the envelope and flipped it over. Thick, expensive paper, gold-embossed lettering. An invitation, or rather, a demand. He tore it open and scanned the contents. A glossy brochure showcased rows of identical beige houses, their perfectly trimmed hedges mirroring each other like clones. The HOA's latest initiative, a mandatory membership for all remaining non-HOA residents. The cost? $5,000 up front, with monthly fees of $350. But it wasn't the money that made Ethan's pulse quicken. It was the property modification list attached to the invitation. Remove all non-approved paint colors, including his grandmother's beloved purple trim. Replace the rose garden with HOA-approved landscaping. Take down all exterior decorations, including wind chimes. He let the paper slip from his fingers, a deep, simmering anger settling in his chest. Across the street, Vanessa stood in her driveway, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes, I just delivered the final invitation," she said, voice laced with confidence. "He has no choice now. His is the last holdout on the street. Once we get rid of that hideous house, the neighborhood's value will skyrocket." Ethan clenched his jaw. She was wrong about one thing. he did have a choice. And she had no idea just how badly she had underestimated him. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the invitation from the HOA lying open in front of him like a declaration of war. He had spent years in courtrooms, watching people manipulate laws to serve their own greed, but never had the battlefield been his own front yard. He wasn't naive. He knew Vanessa Holloway didn't expect him to agree outright. She wanted resistance. She thrived on it. Because resistance meant she could escalate. She could use every dirty trick in the book to make his life miserable until he had no choice but to submit. Well, if she was looking for a fight, she had come to the right place. The first shot fired. The next morning, Ethan found a bright orange violation notice taped to his front door. Violation: unauthorized exterior color. Fine, $250. He laughed dryly. It had begun. By the end of the week, the violations piled up. Overgrown vegetation, his grandmother's roses. Unauthorized wind chimes. Apparently, a noise disturbance. Lack of uniformity. His house didn't blend with the rest of the neighborhood. Each new letter was more absurd than the last. He ignored them all. Vanessa, however, was relentless. She wanted him gone, and she wasn't just going to rely on fines to do it. One morning, as Ethan stepped out onto his porch with his coffee, he spotted her in the distance. Vanessa, flanked by 2 HOA board members, was standing on the sidewalk across from his house. She wasn't alone. A group of residents had gathered, whispering amongst themselves, throwing judgmental glances at his home. Some of them were taking photos. Then, Vanessa's voice rang out, sharp and clear. "This property is bringing down home values." Ethan's grip on his mug tightened. "It's outdated, neglected, and frankly, an eyesore," she continued, gesturing toward the Victorian facade as if it were a condemned shack. "We're working to improve this neighborhood, and some people need to decide whether they're going to be part of the future or the past." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had seen mob mentality before, but it was something else to witness it when the target was his home. Not today, Vanessa. He set his coffee down, walked to the edge of his porch, and met her gaze head-on. "This house has stood for 3 generations," he said, his voice steady. "It's not going anywhere." Vanessa's fake smile barely faltered, but he saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Oh, Ethan," she sighed dramatically, stepping forward. "We're just looking out for the community. You must understand that change is inevitable. You can either embrace it or fight it and suffer the consequences." "Is that a threat?" Ethan asked, tilting his head slightly. She laughed, shaking her head. "Of course not. But accidents do happen." A chill ran down his spine. Vanessa wasn't just playing games anymore. The harassment escalates. The next few weeks were a campaign of psychological warfare. A landscaping crew showed up at 7 a.m. every Saturday, conveniently working as loudly as possible near his bedroom window. Trash mysteriously ended up on his lawn overnight. HOA members parked their cars in front of his driveway, blocking him in for hours. Code enforcement officers arrived weekly, responding to anonymous complaints about his home. Each time, Ethan met them at the door, documentation in hand, proving he was in full compliance with historic preservation laws. Each time, Vanessa watched from her porch, seething. But the worst came when he spotted a woman standing in his yard one Tuesday morning, measuring his grass with a ruler. Ethan stepped outside. "Can I help you?" The woman, Barbara from the HOA, clicked her pen and jotted something down. 11.5 inches, she announced. 3.5 inches over regulation. Ethan rubbed his temples. "Barbara, my property isn't subject to HOA regulations." Barbara smiled stiffly. "You'll be hearing from us soon." Sure enough, an official letter arrived days later. "Failure to maintain lawn, $500 fine." Ethan filed it away with the rest of the nonsense. But this wasn't just about fines. This was about breaking him down 1 inch at a time. And then, they crossed the line. A sinister turn. One night, Ethan was reviewing security footage when he saw something that made his blood freeze. The HOA board members, Vanessa, Michael, and Richard, were on his property. At midnight, they stood near his electrical box, whispering, pointing. Richard tapped the box with his flashlight. Vanessa nodded approvingly. Then, they moved toward his grandmother's rose garden. Ethan watched as Michael pulled out a spray canister and began dousing the plants. His heritage roses, his grandmother's legacy. A white-hot rage burned through him. Ethan grabbed his phone and stormed outside. "What do you think you're doing?" he called out, his voice low and dangerous. Vanessa spun around, unfazed. Her smirk returned. "Oh, Ethan. We're just ensuring compliance," she said sweetly. "HOA regulations prohibit invasive plant species, and some residents have complained about the smell of these old roses." Ethan took another step forward. "These aren't invasive. They've been here since 1960, and they're registered with the Gardening Society. You're trespassing." Michael shuffled uncomfortably. Richard took a step back. "But Vanessa?" She held her ground. "You're not part of the HOA, Ethan, but this neighborhood has standards, and we take those standards seriously." Ethan clenched his jaw. That's when he saw movement across the street. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly woman who had confided in him, watching from behind her curtains. She had been through this before. She knew what happened to those who resisted. And Ethan realized, in that moment, this wasn't about property values. This was about power. Vanessa didn't just want his house gone. She wanted him gone. As the HOA retreated, Ethan stood in the dark, watching them disappear into the night. He knew one thing for certain. This wasn't going to end with a simple violation notice. And if Vanessa thought he was going to roll over and let them win, she was gravely mistaken. Ethan spent the next few nights in front of his computer, meticulously reviewing the security footage. His gut told him Vanessa and her cronies weren't just out to harass him. They were orchestrating something bigger. And then he saw it. The HOA board members weren't just tampering with his roses that night. They had spent a full 20 minutes examining his electrical box, gas line, and water meter. Why? Ethan rewound the footage, zooming in. Richard, the ex-cop, had been pointing at specific areas that, if damaged, could cause a catastrophic accident. His stomach turned. They weren't just trying to force him out with fines and citations. They were setting him up for something much worse. A community under siege. Determined to find out more, Ethan started knocking on doors. He visited neighbors who had been in the area longer than Vanessa's reign of terror. Most were hesitant to talk. Some pretended they didn't hear him. But then, on a quiet afternoon, an elderly woman named Margaret Whitmore let him inside her home. She shut the door carefully behind him, casting nervous glances toward the street before speaking in a hushed tone. "I knew they'd come for you eventually," she whispered. Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Margaret's frail hands trembled as she reached for an old photo album. She flipped to a page with a picture of a house that looked eerily similar to his, but it was gone now. That was the Jensen family's home. Beautiful Victorian, like yours. They refused to join the HOA. "What happened?" Ethan asked. Margaret swallowed hard. "First the complaints, then the fines, then—" Her voice wavered. "Then the fire." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Electrical failure," she said bitterly. "At least that's what the HOA and the fire inspector ruled it as." Ethan's mind reeled. Fire inspector? Who was the investigator? Margaret gave him a sharp look. Richard Lawson, the ex-cop. The same man Ethan had seen in his footage, poking around his property. A sickening realization settled in his gut. This wasn't about making the neighborhood look better. This was a coordinated land grab. The trail of displaced homeowners. Ethan spent the next few days digging through county records. One by one, he found them. 14 homes in the past 5 years, all following the same pattern. The owner refuses to join the HOA. A sudden influx of complaints, fines, and citations. Harassment escalates. Then, a mysterious fire, electrical problem, or structural damage forces them to leave. The property is purchased by an unknown shell company. At a fraction of its real value. The company's owner? Catherine Holloway. Vanessa's sister. Ethan exhaled sharply, gripping the edges of the file in front of him. They had perfected this scheme, and they thought no one would ever connect the dots. A sinister warning. That night, Ethan made sure every security camera on his property was active and repositioned. He wasn't taking any chances. At 3:17 a.m., motion sensors lit up his phone screen. Someone was outside. Ethan moved swiftly to the window, keeping the lights off. He peered through the curtain and saw them, two figures in dark clothing creeping toward his electrical box. His pulse pounded in his ears. One of them knelt down, pulling something from their pocket. A tool? A wire cutter? Ethan grabbed his phone, hit record, and dialed 911. Before he could make a sound, his security floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the entire yard. The intruders froze. One of them, Richard, whipped around, eyes wide with shock. The other turned to flee, but Ethan's cameras had already captured their faces. They were sloppy, they were desperate, and now they were exposed. Richard raised his hands defensively, backing away. "Ethan, let's not make this a big deal." Ethan stepped onto the porch, voice cold as ice. "You have 30 seconds to get off my property before the cops get here." Richard hesitated. Ethan took another step forward, his eyes never leaving theirs. 20. Vanessa's cronies scrambled back toward the shadows. Richard lingered for a split second before spitting onto the ground. "You're making a mistake, Caldwell." Ethan didn't blink. "No. You did." Richard and his accomplice bolted just as sirens howled in the distance. Ethan watched them go, jaw tight. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was an act of war. And if Vanessa Holloway thought she could keep getting away with this, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. The night was still. Too still. Ethan sat in his dimly lit study, the weight of everything he had uncovered pressing down on him. His security footage, the county records, the whispered stories from terrified neighbors. Each piece pointed to something darker than a simple HOA dispute. This was organized destruction, a well-oiled machine designed to terrorize homeowners into submission. And tonight, something felt wrong. He glanced at the time, 3:02 a.m. His phone screen remained dark. No motion alerts from his cameras, no disturbances outside. Just silence. A silence that felt engineered. Then, the smell hit him. Smoke. A thick, acrid scent seeped in through the vents. His pulse spiked. He spun toward the window, and his stomach dropped. Outside, the night sky glowed an eerie orange. His house was on fire. A raging inferno, Ethan exploded out of his chair, grabbing his phone as he sprinted toward the front door. But as soon as he reached for the knob, he felt the heat, searing, unnatural, deadly. Flames were already licking up the sides of his Victorian home, consuming the wood with terrifying speed. The fire had spread too fast. This wasn't an accident. Someone had planned this. Smoke curled into his lungs, choking the air from his body. He dropped low, crawling toward the back door. But an explosion from the gas line in the kitchen sent a fiery shockwave through the house, knocking him flat. Panic surged through his veins. He needed to get out. Now. Through the smoke, he saw the hallway window. Ignoring the pain in his ribs, he lunged toward it, throwing his weight against the glass. It shattered, sending shards slicing into his arms. But he didn't care. He hoisted himself through the opening, rolling onto the dewy grass outside. The cool air hit him like a slap, but he barely had time to gasp before another explosion rocked the foundation of the house. He scrambled backward, watching in horror as centuries of history burned to the ground. And then, he saw her. Vanessa's smug triumph. Across the street, standing in her pristine driveway, was Vanessa Holloway. She was smiling. Her silk robe was neatly tied, her blonde hair perfectly styled, and in her hands, she held a steaming cup of coffee, like she was watching a morning show, not a tragedy. A small group of HOA members gathered around her, whispering and pointing at different parts of the fire. They weren't even trying to hide their satisfaction. Ethan's hands curled into fists, blood dripping from his cuts onto the pavement. Firefighters arrived, sirens wailing, but he already knew what they would say. Electrical fire, faulty wiring, an old house gone up in flames. A neat, tidy explanation. just like all the others. Fire Chief Daniel Martinez approached him, his face grim. "Sir, it looks like an electrical—" "No, it doesn't," Ethan cut him off, voice raw. "I had an inspection done last week. Everything was up to code." The chief hesitated. "I'll have my men do a deeper—" "Don't bother," Ethan said, eyes locked onto Vanessa across the street. "I already know who did this." Vanessa met his gaze, sipping her coffee slowly, deliberately. And then, in the pettiest display of dominance he had ever seen, she raised her mug in a mock toast. Ethan's vision went red. A sinister plot unfolds through the crowd of onlookers. Two familiar figures lurked near the edge of the scene, Richard Lawson and Michael Green, Vanessa's right-hand men. They were trying to blend in, but Ethan recognized the boots. The same work boots he had seen on his security footage last week, when his rose bushes were vandalized. Now, they were covered in fresh mud. Or was it ash? The pieces clicked into place with chilling clarity. This had been planned. Perfectly. The motion cameras shutting off, the gas line sabotage, the calculated timing, late enough for deep sleep, early enough for the fire department to take time to respond. And Vanessa, standing there like she had just won a game. But she had made one mistake. She thought Ethan was defeated. She thought she had broken him. She had no idea she had just awakened something far worse. A declaration of war. Ethan wiped the blood from his arm, straightened his back and pulled out his phone. 3 calls. One to his friend at the FBI, one to his contact at the state attorney's office, and one to a private investigator he trusted with his life. As he dialed, he caught Vanessa watching him, a flicker of curiosity crossing her face. She didn't know who he was calling. And that uncertainty? That was the first crack in her perfect little empire. Good. Let her wonder. Let her worry. Because while his house lay in ruins, his real power had nothing to do with property. It had everything to do with justice. The fallout begins. The fire was finally extinguished by dawn, leaving behind a charred skeleton of what was once his home. Ethan stood among the ashes, his hands buried in his pockets, his mind already 5 steps ahead. Vanessa thought she had won, but she had underestimated the wrong man. A faint glint of color caught his eye among the rubble. He crouched down, brushing away soot and debris until he found it. A small, charred piece of purple trim. His grandmother's paint. A surge of determination coursed through him. This wasn't just about his house. This was about everyone Vanessa had done this to. The Jensens, the Whitmores, the 14 other families forced from their homes, and Ethan wasn't going to stop until every last one of them got justice. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, he turned toward Vanessa's house one last time. She was still there, watching him. But this time, he saw it. A flicker of something behind her arrogant smirk. A seed of doubt. And Ethan smiled, because she was right to be afraid. Final thought, she thought she had buried him in the ashes of his home. But all she had done was light the fire of his revenge. Ethan had always believed in patience. He had built his career as a federal judge on the principle that justice, though slow, was inevitable. But after watching his home, his family's legacy, burn to the ground, patience was no longer an option. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every single person Vanessa Holloway and her HOA empire had destroyed. And Ethan was about to turn the game against them. The investigation begins. By the time the last embers of his house had cooled, Ethan had already set his plan in motion. His first move? Follow the money. He spent hours combing through county records, banking transactions, and property sales. And what he found was staggering. Every house that had mysteriously burned down or been abandoned had been purchased at a fraction of its value by a shell company. That shell company was owned by Catherine Holloway, Vanessa's sister. The properties were then flipped and sold to a real estate development firm, whose executives had been spotted at Vanessa's HOA meetings. It was a perfect scam. Harass, destroy, acquire, profit. And the worst part? They had been doing this for years. Ethan's rage simmered beneath the surface, but he kept his expression neutral, controlled, dangerous. Because while Vanessa thought he was licking his wounds, he was setting a trap. A key witness. steps forward. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Vanessa's former HOA treasurer, Melissa Carter, reached out through Ethan's lawyer. She was terrified, but she had evidence. Over coffee in a quiet diner, 2 towns over, she slid a USB drive across the table, her hands trembling. "I kept records," she whispered. "I knew what Vanessa was doing, but I was too scared to stop her. She made me falsify reports, money laundering, fraudulent maintenance fees, hush payments. It's all there." Ethan plugged in his laptop and scanned the files. Deposits, wire transfers, property acquisition logs. Melissa had kept everything. It was enough to bury Vanessa Holloway for decades. But Ethan wasn't ready to strike yet, because he still needed one more piece: the smoking gun. Ethan had suspected it for weeks, but now, with Melissa's help, he confirmed it. Richard Lawson, Vanessa's enforcer, was the one who signed off on every suspicious fire investigation. The ex-cop. The man who had been caught trespassing on Ethan's property just before the fire. And now, Ethan had proof that he'd falsified fire reports for years. But the real question was why. Ethan dug deeper. Richard's bank records showed suspicious deposits from an anonymous offshore account. A few more phone calls. A few more favors pulled. And then, the final piece clicked into place. The offshore account was linked to a luxury real estate developer who had been trying to push through a massive commercial project. The problem? The land wasn't available, until the HOA forced homeowners to sell. And now Ethan had everything. The fires weren't just about control, they were about profit. Vanessa's HOA wasn't just a power-hungry nightmare, it was a criminal enterprise. And Ethan was about to bring it crashing down, setting the trap. Ethan met with his contacts at the FBI and the state attorney's office. They wired up Melissa and sent her into an HOA meeting with a small recording device hidden in her purse. The plan was simple: get Vanessa talking. Melissa played her role perfectly. Over wine and expensive hors d'oeuvres in Vanessa's mansion, she casually brought up Ethan's house fire. "Such a tragedy," she sighed, swirling her drink. "But at least he's out of the way now, right?" Vanessa laughed. "People like him don't understand progress. They cling to the past like it means something. But soon, this entire street will be part of something better." Melissa took a careful sip of her wine. "And what about the others? The ones who didn't want to sell?" Vanessa smirked, tapping her manicured nails against her glass. "Accidents happen." Melissa forced a giggle. "Like electrical accidents?" Vanessa leaned in, eyes gleaming. Exactly. That was all they needed. The HOA's final meeting. 2 nights later, Ethan stood outside the community center, watching Vanessa strut inside with her usual arrogance. She had no idea what was coming. Inside, the HOA meeting was business as usual. Vanessa stood at the front of the room, her signature coffee mug in one hand, a stack of papers in the other. "Now, as I was saying, we have urgent business regarding property at 247 Maple Street." Ethan pushed open the doors. The room fell silent. Every HOA member turned, stunned at his presence. Vanessa's smirk wavered for the first time. Ethan walked down the center aisle, slow, deliberate, every step echoing through the tense silence. "I object, Mrs. Holloway." The words cut through the room like a blade. Vanessa's fingers tightened around her mug. "You have no authority here, Ethan." Ethan pulled a thick folder from his briefcase and spread the documents across the table. "Actually, I do." The room gasped as they saw the evidence: bank records, property transactions, secret emails, falsified fire reports. Vanessa's face paled. "These security cameras show you and your board members on my property the night of the fire," Ethan continued, flipping to a page with photo stills from his footage. Vanessa's hands started to shake. "And these?" Ethan held up another file. "Wire transfers from the real estate developer funding this entire operation. They paid you to burn down homes and drive out residents, didn't they?" The room erupted into whispers. Vanessa opened her mouth, grasping for a defense. But then the doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed inside. "Nobody move!" Vanessa froze. Richard Lawson tried to make a break for the emergency exit. He barely made it 3 steps before he was tackled to the ground. Vanessa stumbled backward, her breath ragged. Ethan walked up to her, his voice low and cold. "You thought you could destroy me, but you forgot to check who you were messing with." She stared at him, horror dawning in her eyes. As FBI agents snapped handcuffs onto her wrists, Ethan picked up her precious coffee mug, the one she had toasted him with while his house burned. He turned it over in his hands, then set it down on the table. Meeting adjourned. And with that, Vanessa Holloway was dragged away, her reign of terror over. But Ethan, he was just getting started. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled, every eye fixed on the front, where Vanessa Holloway sat stiffly in her designer suit. Gone was the arrogance, the smugness. Instead, she was pale, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles had turned white. Ethan watched from the judge's bench, his expression unreadable. He had spent his career upholding the law, but this was personal. "All rise," the bailiff announced. The murmurs in the gallery died down as Ethan straightened his robe and looked down at the woman who had destroyed his home, terrorized his neighbors, and ruined countless lives, all in the name of greed. "Court is now in session," Ethan declared, his voice calm but firm. "United States versus Vanessa Holloway and the Maple Ridge HOA Board, charged with conspiracy, fraud, arson, and racketeering." A ripple of tension moved through the room. The prosecution stood. "Your Honor, the state intends to present overwhelming evidence proving that the defendants engaged in a years-long scheme to force homeowners out of their properties through harassment, property destruction, and, ultimately, arson. We have financial records, security footage, wiretap recordings, and witness testimony, all pointing to a criminal conspiracy orchestrated by Mrs. Holloway." Ethan glanced toward Vanessa. Her eyes darted to her lawyer, desperate, pleading. Then, the first recording played. "People like him don't understand progress," Vanessa's voice echoed through the courtroom. "They cling to the past. Accidents happen." The jury's faces hardened. Then came the bank statements. Large cash deposits tied directly to property acquisitions after each house fire. Then the fire reports, all signed off by Richard Lawson, all conveniently ruling the blazes as accidents. And finally, the witnesses. One by one, Ethan watched as former homeowners stood before the court, their voices shaking but resolute. The Whitmores, forced out after their home mysteriously flooded. The Jensens, whose Victorian burned under suspicious circumstances. Melissa Carter, Vanessa's former treasurer, who confessed to falsifying HOA financial reports under threats from Vanessa. Then, the final betrayal. Richard Lawson, the ex-cop, flipped. Under pressure, he broke down, spilling everything. "We planned it all," he admitted. "The citations, the fines, the accidents. Vanessa gave the orders. I made sure the reports covered it up. It was all about money." Vanessa screamed, slamming her hands against the table. "You're lying," she shrieked. "This is a setup." Ethan simply picked up his gavel. "Enough," he said. His voice was quiet, but the power behind it was unmistakable. Then, he delivered the verdict. "Vanessa Holloway, you are sentenced to 25 years in federal prison." Her mouth fell open in a silent gasp. As the bailiffs cuffed her, Ethan met her gaze one last time. "Justice," he said evenly, "has arrived." 6 months had passed since the trial, but the echoes of Vanessa Holloway's empire still lingered. Ethan stood in front of his newly rebuilt home, the Victorian masterpiece restored to its former glory. The purple trim, the very color Vanessa had tried to erase, shone proudly in the morning sun. The heritage rose garden, resurrected from a single surviving cutting, swayed gently in the breeze. Justice had been served. But the scars remained. The neighborhood had changed. Without Vanessa's iron grip, the HOA had collapsed. In its place, the residents had formed a real community association, not one built on control and greed, but on trust, mutual respect, and genuine support. The Jensens had moved back, reclaiming the home they had been forced to sell. The Whitmores were no longer afraid to tend to their gardens. Melissa Carter, once Vanessa's reluctant pawn, had become an advocate for HOA reform, working to prevent others from suffering the same fate. And Vanessa? She sat in a federal prison, serving 25 years, stripped of her power, her wealth, and her carefully crafted reputation. The Holloway sisters' shell companies had been dismantled, their fraudulent empire reduced to nothing. Ethan exhaled, gripping his coffee mug, Vanessa's old coffee mug, the very one she had raised in triumph as his house burned. Now, it sat on his desk in the courthouse, a silent reminder of who he had fought and won against. But this was bigger than one corrupt HOA. This was about power and greed, about those who manipulate systems to exploit the people who trust them. It was about standing up when the odds are stacked against you. It was about fighting back when bullies try to take what's yours. Because here's the truth. There will always be Vanessas in the world. There will always be people who think they can control you, who believe that fear and intimidation will force you to surrender. But they only win if we let them. Ethan glanced down at the roses his grandmother had planted so many years ago. They had survived the fire, the destruction, the attempted erasure of history, because they were meant to bloom again. And so was he. What about you? Have you ever faced a situation where someone tried to take something from you? Your home, your peace, your dignity? How did you fight back? Share your story in the comments. Let's talk about standing up for what's right. And if you love stories of justice, revenge, and people taking their power back, make sure to subscribe to the Story Forge. Because sometimes, the best way to win is to rebuild something stronger than what was destroyed.